But I think the ability to engage with other cultures and in exchange programs of various types will be enormously enhanced by learning another language. So I think in those ways also, Queen Mary is very much engaged with developing this area. I think that probably just about covers what I was going to say.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to get the discussion going by asking a few questions myself, questions that don't necessarily represent views I hold. I think I've got to be a bit of a devil's advocate here, and after a couple of minutes we'll open the discussion. I want to start with a big question before coming to the more detailed work that Queen Mary or any university does of the kind that we've been hearing about. There was, when you read the bit of rhetoric in there, and there was a reference to the economy. Is it the case that an economically successful nation needs great and successful universities? Or is it simply that economically successful countries have enough money to generate successful and important and ultimately great universities?
I think it's the first of those, but you would expect me to say that. I don't actually think that universities are kind of extra little hobby things that economies generate if they've got a bit of spare cash. There is quite a lot of evidence that development models that rely on, particularly the last 50 years, that rely on investment in education have been very successful. I think China is certainly seeing education as one of the keys to creating a genuinely international economic trajectory. So I think that there is certainly some evidence that they do seem to be locked together in such a way that if you don't invest substantially in high levels of education for a reasonably substantial proportion of the population, perhaps a larger percentage of the population than we currently educate to that high level, then it will be a bit of a blockage on your economic development. So I would say it's that way around.
Because another way to do it, of course, is to piggyback on others and send, as some developing countries do,
yep,
vast numbers of young people abroad.
Indeed, and that is another way to do it. And I think it's interesting to think about what the advantages are and why is it that many countries that begin by doing that actually then go on to use the graduates of that process to develop their own national system. And I think it's an interesting point because I was talking about a global economy and the need for graduates to be flexible and to be able to work in different economic systems and different national systems. I also do think universities continue to be part of a national cultural conversation and part of a national economy at the same time as they're connected into these global structures. And you lose something about your capacity to innovate and to actually have that national cultural conversation if you don't have your own higher education system, I think.
Do you want to pick up on that? Or?
Oh, absolutely agree. I think, obviously England and America indeed are in an advantageous situation in speaking the language that happens to be the global language, but that is to some extent an accident which we're benefiting from. And I suppose from the point I was saying earlier on, it actually might even benefit our own education system if more of our people did go abroad on exchange programs than actually currently is the case.
Now, Alan, you were speaking about communication skills in particular and foreign language skills, and I've seen the work that you've been leading on developing the attributes that a Queen Mary graduate should have. Is this a university being required to do work that should have been satisfactorily accomplished in the schools after 12 or 13 years of education?
I don't think that it is. I think we have relatively recently begun to articulate the complex relationships between thinking and writing in ways that show that for everybody to be able to handle complex ideas and communicate them consistently and effectively is a very high level skill. And actually, we never expected our first year undergraduates to come in and write essays that read like third year undergraduates. We knew that their writing skills were hugely developed in the course of the education we
But
gave them.
didn't we used to expect them to know where to put the full stop and the apostrophes?
I think we might have hoped they did. I don't think they always did. I mean, we are educating to a higher level a greater percentage of the population. So it's bound to be the case that the educational backgrounds they bring to us are more varied. But I do think that we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which, you know, we would see first-year undergraduates coming into a university 20 years ago, and we would know that in terms of sophistication, the capacity to sustain an argument over 3,000 words, 5,000 words, that was something they had to learn. And they learned it by writing all the time. I mean, certainly as an undergraduate student, I wrote substantial essays 2 or 3 times a week throughout the course of my degree programme. And one of the things that happened was as we brought in more and more students, that came under pressure. And so people were writing less, and it becomes a problem.
And now?
I think we're now beginning to produce ways in which we can work with them through different sorts of methods. So they're not producing a full essay 3 times a week, but they are writing very consistently, and we're paying attention to it. So I think it's only become a problem because we didn't used to talk about it. We pursued a mode of education that needed to change, and we hadn't recognized it. And now we've come back again and said high-level thinking is associated with unusual levels of advanced literacy, and we actually need to work with students to let them attain that.
Absolutely, and I think I referred to writing as being invisible, and I think one of the problems with it, there isn't an established discourse around writing other than what you tend to read about in the national press, where it is always depicted as a problem. And if you go back decades, even centuries, writing has always been depicted as a problem. It's always been getting worse, and it's an indicator of how poorly educated people are. But I think it's actually, we are now beginning to see that it is not just something that you graft on top of an education. It is part of the process of creating knowledge. If you're creating knowledge at a high level, writing is going to be difficult. And I think we appreciate that it is a legitimate part of the business of the university to be looking at it.
And just one final question from me, and very different from the one I just asked. I've lost count, literally, of the number of universities or higher education institutions in this country. It's not part of my daily life now, so and it's not necessarily a critical comment, to put it that way, but they're really. Does anybody know how many we've got?
It depends what you're counting, but yes, it's about 140.
Right. Well, now in America, where they have huge numbers, thousands of universities and colleges, they all fit into quite discrete groupings, and people are happy to be in whatever, you know, from the great research universities through doctoral granting, all the way down to liberal arts colleges and vocational colleges, and they all have a very clear focus and mission. And I get the impression here that everyone's doing exactly the same thing, and everybody's trying to be like Bristol and Oxford and Cambridge and Durham.
Yes. Well, funding levers do drive behaviours in quite interesting ways. So people felt that economic viability depended on saying that they were all doing the same thing. And that's tended to be what universities have done in the last decade. I think the discussion now about the future funding for universities is raising that question really interestingly. I mean, obviously, there is a proposal that it might be that students have to contribute more to the cost of their education. And in some cases, that could lead to very substantial fees that have to be paid. I haven't yet seen any model of that doesn't drive enormous distinctions between the kinds of institutions that will result. So if we go down that route, we will have a very diverse university system, and we will have some interesting political challenges about fair access to that system, I think. There is another model which is being promoted very interestingly by the National Union of Students, and actually very effectively by them, which is not to go down that route, but to go for the graduate tax and then hypothecate it through a trust. And the trust would have as its mission the overall health of the university sector. And on that model, all universities would continue to be quite similar, and they would all be funded so that they could achieve what their educational mission was appropriately. So I think we have an interesting political choice ahead of us. If we were to ask Vice-Chancellors what their preferences were, I think there would be more who would prefer the variation, actually, than who would prefer the managed equality model of NUS. But I think it's an interesting choice.
You won't get any sense out of Vice-Chancellors, not collectively at any rate. But I've always been puzzled by you about students funding higher education. We were having those debates in the pre-tuition fee days when I was on what was then called the